Dober večer, good evening, welcome everyone. John Lee Anderson, welcome to the Festival of Slovenian Journalistic Society. We are all so happy you could join us today after COVID restrictions prevented you from joining us at the very beginning of the festival, namely yesterday. Can you tell us what happened?
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you as well. Now from Chile. Well, I was planning to speak with you, yesterday, but was unable to get on the flight I had intended to get on, to my great frustration, in Mexico. Because, you know, as many countries are doing, they're coming up with last-minute regulations. So just as I had my COVID test, it was negative, which was a requirement to fly from Mexico to Chile, but they didn't tell me about having proof of medical insurance and also an electronic sworn declaration of about 3 or 4 pages long. So between the two, I couldn't make the flight. And said I had to fly via the United States to get to Chile overnight. So I've been here a few hours and I had all my things in order, but you know, each country is trying to deal with this COVID problem as best they can. And sometimes they make up the rules on the trot. And that's what happened. So
we know it all from our country. Yeah, I'm sure you knew that before all of us, of course. BBC just had breaking news that Diego Maradona, Argentina legend, died. This is big news in your part of the world, isn't it?
It really is. You know, he was, some people called him the right hand of God. You know, he was big. In recent years, he was kind of a, you know, almost a vaudevillian character, or, you know, some people regarded him as an absurd figure, but he was always revered. You know, he had terrible problems with drug dependency and alcoholism, but he was still beloved. You know, over the last, 45 years, he's been an international icon and probably is the best known athlete in the entire world.
Exactly.
You know, it'll be very big here. There will be people weeping tonight in Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Are you sure you won't have to write the daily dispatches for New Yorker from Chile about this subject?
I haven't received that. I was looking nervously at my phone and hoping that I wouldn't get a request to write an obituary, but I might. And in fact, part of me thinks that I should, although I'm not really a sports guy. He inhabits a different realm, more in the realm of the mythological. And that, in that sense, he's an intriguing figure.
Yeah.
Because of his political associations as well.
Yeah.
So he was close to Fidel Castro, for instance, and and so maybe I will write something quick.
Okay, we have to check New Yorker's page tomorrow or the day after. Can you share with us briefly, why are you in Chile right now? Does it have anything to do with the process of political change, recent votes, scraping the country's dictatorship era constitution, maybe?
Sure, yes, it does in part. I mean, I try to do trips through the region. I mean, it's become a kind of pattern. Sometimes I travel a lot, but this past year has been strange, you know. So this time last year, I did a run through Latin America in precisely at this time of year. I was in Mexico, Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, and Brazil before I went home for Christmas, over about a month and a half. I'm doing something similar, mostly because I've been away all of this year. I have been to Africa and parts of Europe and the United States, but this is the region of my, it's my muse and the place where I know so many people. So I had come to the United States, where I live in England, but I'd gone to the United States to vote. This time I wanted to be sure my vote was counted. Mm-hmm. And then I was in Washington to meet people that I thought might be part of a new Biden administration, California to visit a daughter, Mexico, because Mexico is key also with US policies, and Chile. I have very good friends here, but also I wanted to see the latest in what is this interesting social process underway, as you pointed out. And from here, I'll probably go to Brazil as well, because I've been chipping away, so to speak, journalistically at the Bolsonaro phenomenon as one that is the most analogous to the Trump, authoritarian nationalism phenomenon in the region, in the hemisphere. So I'll probably do another story there because it will, of course, Trump may leave, but Bolsonaro is going to be staying, and he's causing, real havoc in his country.
Yeah. Okay, we will talk much more about your Latin America experience later on, but let's begin with the newspaper that you launched when you were about 9 years old. You were living in Taiwan with your family. Where did this urge to inform your audience at such an early age come from?
I usually attribute it to my mother, although both of my parents were kind of wonderful storytellers. My father was not a writer, but he was a great storyteller in person, teller of tall tales. My mother was a writer of children's books and inculcated the love of books and reading aloud, and also of art from a very early age. And so, I was very young, so I can't recall the specifics, but I do know that she was a key part of the process. Whether it was her idea or mine, I became the editor of my own little newspaper. So it was a great source of pride. And I immediately, employed my brothers, sisters, and friends as my reporters and sent them out into our neighborhood and beyond as much as I could to collect news. And my mother typed it up with me kind of helping edit on and with carbon paper, and then stapling them together. And then I would take them around to the neighbors and try to sell them for 5 cents. And as I recall, my first scoop in my life was informing one of our neighbors that his wife was pregnant before he knew. I printed it. But some of the stories were also about, a haunted house that all of us children believed was haunted. So I collected everyone's versions of what they thought they had seen in that haunted house, or what they thought it was. And also what kids wanted to be when they grew up, I wanted to be about 15 things, and I think it's there, So it was great fun. And I suppose it was a kind of early framework to channel and encompass my interests and my curiosity in the world, and a way for me to engage beyond that of a simple child. It was an interesting exercise. Yeah.
John Lee, I really liked your story in New Yorker's August edition about your formative trip to Alaska when you were about 21, and you decided to get rich by collecting musk ox wool. That was in 1978. And let me show you. Yeah. This is John Lee. Can everyone see this really well? Because I suggest you read it as well, apart from look at the beautiful pictures. I wonder if it's still possible to do such exciting and crazy things as you did at that trip and other trips you did, because you were a really restless child and restless teenager. Is this possible? Is it still possible to do all those things in 2020?
I would love to say,
not only because of COVID, but
sure.
Society.
I would love to think that it is, Senia, because if without some notion of the unknown and of adventure, I can't imagine what youth would be like. I feel inevitably as you get older, you get more cynical and hard-bitten, and you think everything's changed for the worse. And in some ways it has. The world's gotten smaller. With GPS, there's now no single spot on Earth that's not visible somehow, which is rather sad. And I remember feeling long before GPS that the world was shrinking. in front of me before I had a chance to explore the unknown, which was precisely why I went off to, the Bering Sea and Alaska, or to the Peruvian Amazon. And but I think so. I came to a reckoning with this in my 30s. I realized that, the world was shrinking. It was changing in ways that were distressing to me. The true, or, the eternal wild was becoming something else. But I realized that the true value of journeying and of discovery, I guess is the better word, is not so much the physical space as what's in people's minds. And this, I found a kind of great source of, it was both a kind of epiphany and a great source of relief in a way. And it's no relief to see what's happening to the physical world, although parts of it remain wild. But what's in the minds of men and women around the world. There are parts of the world that then fall off the modern map for decades. And I mean, look what's happened in the United States. It's becoming a faith-based society, something 10 or 15 years ago, I would have associated with the Middle East. And so, and I've been with people in Afghanistan who truly inhabit the year 1384. It's, it's not 2000 and whatever. It really is 6 centuries earlier in terms of their awareness of the world, the larger world, its history, and their interaction with its with known knowledge. So in that sense, the world remains to me an incredibly complex and intriguing place, and I've found that's that allows me to continue to feel that that I'm in a way, journalism is merely a means to an end. I'm still on a voyage of discovery. If I felt that the world was completely known, I think it would be very sad. I would give up, but I don't think it is. It can be dangerous, In the 70s, you could pretty much go everywhere in the world. Now there's many parts of the world that are too dangerous to go, depending on how you look, whether you're a woman, whether you're a Westerner, or for that matter, whether you're Black or a Muslim. It's become a very complex and hostile world in many ways, but there's always corners that can be explored. And sometimes it's not about, like I say, about the physical space, but about the mental one. So.
But even in 70s and 80s, and when the world was maybe not just as dangerous as it is nowadays, or we perceive it this way, you did some really dangerous things. I mean, when you were like freelancing for Time magazine in Central America, the bureau chief of Time encouraged you to be a fire eater and go where other correspondents would never go. But you didn't really need all that encouragement. I mean, you did things in your teens like working as machetero in Honduras, or guiding scientists and students through rainforests in South Africa. So apart from this wish to explore the world and get to know the world, I mean, you also need to be, let's say, really brave, or I could use a lot of other expressions. You don't, you should not have this sense of fear, basically, which you obviously don't have.
Yeah, I was also a prison guard, which fell out of that list when I was 19 for a summer, because I always wanted to know what it was like to be in a prison. I didn't want to be a prison guard, but I was a prison guard. Anyway, from the time I was really young, around the time I had that newspaper, I started making lists of the things I felt I needed to achieve to become a man. And I kept adjusting the lists. I mean, I've found them. My father used to find them and send them to me when I was older. They had things like climb Everest by the age of 18, cross the Sahara from east to west on camel, row across the Atlantic, sometimes before a certain age. that kind of thing. And of course, I didn't achieve all of those things. Some I did, but it was, when I was a child, I was trying to achieve certain things by a certain age. I was a great reader of biographies, and I admired writers and writing, as I explained. So I never quite figured out how I would pair the two, but the writers I most admired were those who also lived big lives. And I realized early on that the people I admired the most were people that had confronted the extremes of their time, and I felt that I had to do something similar. That these were experiences I need to have to complete my personal education. So the kind of formal education I was receiving in schools was never going to be enough. I needed to do this, I needed to do that. I remember when I was about 17, then living in England, I took a sociology course, and the professor gave us these textbooks, and we were supposed to study the divorce statistics of Welsh coal miners from the year 1934. This frustrated me hugely, and I said, there's still coal mining in Wales. Let us go there and go into the mines and live with them for a few weeks. And I said this in the middle of class on the first day in class. And that's what I wanted to do. And he took me aside after class and he said, look, you're absolutely right. But, I have to teach this curriculum. And, it seems like you're not going to be happy in this course. Think about it. And I said, okay, well, I'm not going to stay. Because I wanted to go in the mines. The idea of penetrating the darkness and in these mines that so many writers had, D.H. Lawrence, others had written about, this human drama that's universal. These are the things I wanted to experience. So, yeah, I set about looking for ways in which I could experience everything. And I wasn't afraid. I don't know if fear is something that's learned or innate, but I didn't have any fear as a young boy. And I don't think I learned fear until, much later on when, things happen. And then I was aware that, oh, okay, you almost get murdered, you get kidnapped, whatever. And you feel fear. And so after that, it's about learning to adapt and live with fear in a way that you can still function. And that's what a lot of, say, war reporting I did is about. It's the same as the people who live in a war zone, or in a country that is in war. It's all about fear and managing fear. And that's what it is for warriors and soldiers too. And so that became its own world of exploration for me. But I don't know.
I'm sorry. As you were saying, in your life, you actually reported on so many different subjects, but it is evident that your main interest lies in the nature of organized crime, political violence. You are drawn to the examination of exercise of power. This is your focus, and in your articles and in your books. But is this something that excited you from the very beginning of your journalistic career, or has this interest, or was this interest shaped by certain political events in the world, well, especially in Latin America?
Yeah, they were the latter. I wasn't so. I came and went from an interest in politics. But really, I wanted to be a naturalist when I was a child, when I was very young. I wanted to be, someone who like the naturalist Gerald Durrell or others, going into the forest and finding rare animal species and saving them. And I was fascinated by Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace and these sorts of people. But I don't think I really had much interest in learning pure or hard science. It was more the experience of, of going to the extremes. And also I did have a love of animals and wildlife, which has always remained with me. But politics and my interest in politics came about, yes, in the course of as I began to grow up a bit in living in Central America. You mentioned my experience as a machetero in Honduras. I became aware of what was happening next door in Nicaragua as the Sandinista revolution came underway, and then living in Peru at a time of military dictatorship. And I became and then Central America, I became increasingly aware of the impact that politics had on everyone's lives and how circumscribed freedoms were, sometimes as the result of the whim or the caprice of usually one man, and the regimes that they erected. And so I became very interested in power and the nature of power and of organized violence, because I began to see that many political systems around the world were based on violence. Most societies, in fact, had their birth in some act of blood. And most societies, however civilized today, consecrate those acts of bloodshed, usually through some kind of national creation myth. And some of them are long ago, and you no longer feel the pain or the agony that was caused by those bloodbaths. And, nationalism and nationhood has taken care of laundering those memories so that these are sources of pride and national origin rather than trauma. But so much of the world that I grew up in Africa, Latin America, and even Asia, have been going through these agonizing and unjust processes. And so I began a kind of journey of discovery that to understand the nature of the way violence is a source of political construction and of society itself. And I was always fascinated by this. At what point does violence cease to be illegitimate and become legitimate? Acts of legitimate war now are voted on in the UN, right? And yet there are other acts of war that are not. Meanwhile, all kinds of atrocities occur in the name of a presidency or some kind of sovereign right of this or that government, or a border. We've just seen this in Europe again with Nagorno-Karabakh. Yeah. So we're seeing it today in Ethiopia. And of course, there's other countries where it's happening at the moment. And no doubt there will be more wars in the future, but it's that thin line between the immoral, the moral, the legal and the illegal that I like to explore, because therein lies society's contradictions. And I think we can see in the rise of, say, authoritarian nationalism and populism today, the reemergence, I guess I should say, how violence is used. It can begin with just language and then be deployed to further solidify rule of one sort or another. And then you can watch how society is divided and people begin to espouse violence towards one another. It doesn't take much, as we're seeing, say, in the United States. And I have no doubt that if we, for instance, just speaking of the United States, that if Trump had managed to get another 4 years, and God forbid he's still going to be around, I wouldn't discount the possibility of a new civil war in the United States. I used to think this about 2 years ago. I was afraid to say it out loud, for people would think I was being, outlandish or exaggerated. But just in the last 6 months, since the violence on American streets with Black Lives Matter, since the murder of George Floyd, I think a lot of people around the world have begun to contemplate that's an actual reality. Now, where did all this come from? It came through the organization of violence by Donald Trump. Yeah. So it's something you need to know about.
Yeah. Remember when David Remnick the editor of New Yorker, in 2016, he published this article, The American Tragedy, where he was basically comparing the vote that brought Donald Trump to power to American tragedy. And he said that terrible things are going to happen during the time of his mandate. And maybe someone was thinking, oh, wow, he's a little bit exaggerating. But looking at this article back, he maybe even a little bit underestimated the horrible things that are going to... It was not believable what he was writing, but he was absolutely right, wasn't it?
Yes, he was absolutely right. And I think those of us, I mean, I felt a kind of deep heaviness fall on my, soul in this time. It was Trump's arrival was part of a global phenomenon that I'd begun to feel happening since the year before, with the wave of migrants into Europe, and also the terrorism and the reaction to it, and the rise of these new authoritarians, and this kind of language of racism and exclusion. And as someone who had spent so much time in different places in conflict, I felt that we were careening. It was just this terrible feeling that the world, and the United States as well, was now lurching into a kind of darkness. And right now, I feel that that we have a chance to come back from the brink. So yes, and in other words, I agree with what you said about David Remnick's piece in 2016. And if anything, he was maybe being too polite.
Yeah. Recently, we have almost entirely focused on South Africa and the rise of Donald Trump, that will now have to leave the White House, coincided with the death of Fidel Castro in Cuba. The continent has changed such a great deal from the times when you were beginning your journalistic career to the present situation. And it seems in a way that Donald Trump presidency has brought South America back to the world media spotlight, as it hasn't been for quite a while. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a very good point. I mean, Latin America generally, it's the contiguous region. It's the other part of the hemisphere to the United States. It's where the bulk of the migrants come to the United States. As in most capitalist societies, having destroyed trade unions, most, it includes Western Europe, depend for their skilled and unskilled labor on illegal aliens, on migrants from poorer countries, whether they're documented or undocumented. That's a fact of life. And so because the world is imploding for a lot of reasons, a lot of those people are seeking to come to safety. The United States is a place where once you arrive, there's a kind of rule of law, or there was, where they were that much safer than in their own countries. Latin America has, largely because of the drug economy and chronic injustice, endemic poverty, and an absolute lack of rule of law, corruption, police and judicial corruption, means that the societies are not safe. You have the highest rates of homicide in the world in Latin America, and there are several of the Latin American countries and cities which routinely inhabit the top, amongst the top 5 of countries with records for murder or violent crime. There's simply in Mexico, you can't trust the police. The police very often are the organized criminals. They compete with the state in parts of Latin America. In Brazil, there's in Rio de Janeiro, there's millions of people live under the arms of drug traffickers. It's the same in Venezuela and in Colombia. It's the gangs that hyper-violent gangs in El Salvador but it's also the police and the judges, and a lot of this comes from the narcotics fueled economy that's largely driven by consumer demand in the United States. Something that's new over the last 50 years, revolution, the idea of creating a Marxist insurgency has largely gone away and been replaced by this new, more nihilistic, actually capitalist driven, you could call it a kind of endemic insurgency by the underclass seeking to get its crumbs that fall off the table of the rich. And the rich table is the United States. And everybody is scrambling to try to make it. That's a very crude and cartoonish maybe explanation. But, the left, by and large, driven by the sort of Marxist tenets, and the era of insurgency pioneered by Fidel Castro back in the 60s through the 80s into the 90s, largely failed, have failed. And instead, there was a ruthless and merciless counter tactic led by the United States through military regimes and paramilitaries to counter and squish this. It was capped by the end of the Cold War. And in its wake, over the past 30 years, what you see in Latin America is a kind of laissez-faire democracies, largely exceedingly corrupt. The United States, as the big brother, promoted democracy and elections a lot, but did very little about the due diligence of law and order and rule of law. And it shows, as well as not owning up to their own effect on the region, as I say, through the consumer demand for drugs, which come up from this region, and also the weapons that leave the United States and fuel the homicidal frenzies, the drug wars, and the horrific violence in this region. All of the weapons come from the United States. Just as the rest of the world has come to be horrified at the sight of weapon-carrying teenagers on the streets in the United States wearing paramilitary gear, as if it's their God-given right to do so, those weapons are also flowing south into these countries. The weapons are not coming from Slovenia or Gabon. They're coming from the United States. And this is something that I think the new administration is going to have to deal with. And I think there will have to be something like a Marshall Plan for at least the most worst affected countries closest to the United States, the poorest, the most violent, and where the migrant outflow is the greatest, Central America and the Caribbean, which are also countries, by the way, that are now hugely affected by climate change and where the poverty is only going to get worse, whether it's hurricanes or the change in the climate causing crops to fail. All of these are having a huge impact on these very poor societies, which were agrarian until very recently. And, one cannot compete in a global marketplace with the cheap food imports from the United States, just as much of Europe or the US cannot really compete with cheap manufactured goods that come in from China. It's the same, there's many, many very important things that have to be dealt with. And if they're not, I fear that we're going to be dealing with even greater chaos in the years to come, and possibly the return of civil wars in the region. So Latin America, back to your question, why is it so important? Because it is somehow, and it shouldn't be, it is somehow a failed region. The 30 years of democracy have arguably failed. Many of the countries here, and not entirely through their own fault, have failed. They are failed states and sustained only through their access to illegal markets like narcotics, or the outflow of their migrant people, and the remittances they may send home. It's a tragic and very and a miserable state of dependency that is not sustainable.
Yeah. So many stories you still have to write. So many stories you still have to write. Tell me something. This immediacy of news exhausts itself very quickly nowadays with the rise of so many new media outlets and social media, of course. Does your work for the New Yorker enable you to let's say, avoid this panic of daily news?
Yeah, I mean, I used to think it did, but ever since the New Yorker also got a website and began encouraging us to write blogs and so on, I felt more and more drawn in to being able to report on daily news or comment on events. And so we now have a kind of daily platform, as does every media outlet. So while I still feel most realized with my longer pieces that I can work several months on, I feel this pull of needing to, like you asked about Maradona's death today, for instance, or other phenomena that I'm analyzing as we go along, and that will, if I don't write about it, will fall in between my pieces. So I've done quite a bit of that in the last 7 or 8 years. I probably write something, not exactly daily, but sort of in that more immediate
background, sort of.
Yeah. But either analytical or commentary, probably about one every 6 weeks or something like that. Not always. Sometimes, yeah, about that. And they take, for me, I'm not a quick writer, so I can, if I'm feeling inspired and I'm not exhausted, I can turn something out in, like, I should be able to, in a couple of hours. I have, if someone dies, I've been able to, but in an ideal world, it takes me a day or two to do something of 1,000 or 2,000 words.
Yeah.
I just don't have that training. I'm just slow,
I just wanted to ask you, for someone who's famous in the world for his long reads, for really long stories, is it very difficult for you to keep it short?
Yeah, it is. It is kind of, yeah. As I say, I can write short, but I always feel like there's something more to say, So again, I've done a few, they call them postscripts, like when Garcia Marquez died, who I knew, the writer, a few years ago, I did something, I think I wrote it fairly quickly, or Chavez or Fidel. I mean, I think I wrote the Fidel obit in a day, maybe even within the day. So there are times when a combination of, adrenaline and knowledge have combined in a unique, for me, synergy to allow me to write something in a few hours in a concentrated burst. But usually, I agonize over short things. Yeah.
Tell me, please, how do you choose your stories? And what is the role of the editor in the process of decision being made, which story you eventually will cover and which one not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say 8 out of 10 of the stories I've written in the New Yorker are ones that I've thought of and proposed. If not 9 out of 10, probably, let's say somewhere between 8 and 9 out of 10. And the great thing about the New Yorker is they do allow that, they allow for this kind of freedom of thought, and they allow each of us to, I suppose, find a comfort zone. You also can, inevitably, you get a bit pigeonholed in any media outfit. I think I have been several times at the New Yorker. Probably now, if they talk about me at all, they would say, oh, he's the Latin guy, or he's the guy who likes to go into the jungle, wherever. But for a long time, I was the war guy. And then before that, I think I started out as kind of the Latin jungle tropical guy. and they didn't think of me as a war guy, even though I'd had a whole previous life reporting in conflicts. It wasn't until 9/11, when I volunteered on the day to go to Afghanistan, that, you know, I became their war guy and remained it for a long time. So I follow my own interests largely. If I'm feeling unhappy about what I'm doing, I sometimes it takes me a while to know why, but usually I kind of follow an intuition or an instinct that leads to the stories I feel I need to be doing. And I usually have a long list that I could be doing. And that's where it comes in. I talk to my editor. He says, "What are you thinking?" So usually the editor, he, you know, in this case, it's a guy. I've had 3 in my time at the New Yorker, including 2 women. He will only express interest in 1 or 2, say, of my 6 or 7 ideas I throw out to him. So it's sort of immediately, you know, as this process of elimination. And I'm aware, sometimes I'll say, "So you don't like that 3rd one or 4th one?" And he says, no, but I mean, you know, tell me more. But I can tell he's not really interested, or maybe, and there's a kind of, you know, there's a kind of mystical science back at the New Yorker, and he knows what they want, but I don't really, you know, it's because I'm away. Or there's whether it's something he feels or intuitively knows, or from discussions. So at any rate, you know, sometimes I'll do a story that they're more interested than I am, but with the assurance or promise that I can do that other one next. You know, that's happened a couple of times. Every so often they'll propose one to me and say, what do you think about this one? We thought of you. And I'll say, yeah. You know, I've said, no, not really. But that's, like I say, probably 2 out of 10 or like that. So, you know, I think, you know, as I was saying, back at head office, they must be having discussions every hour, every day. You know, it's this kind of movable feast and people out there. And when you're David Remnick or my editor, Nick Troutwine, you have your own conversations, and they probably talk about us and say, well, it would be great if John Lee did that, or, you know, Ariel did this, and, you know, Evan did that. And they either propose them, or they're already sitting on some conversation in which that's come up. And I suppose David's looking at the future magazines and what the public respond to, and what. Sure. So it's this arcane process that goes forward.
It is quite frustrating to hear that, you know, because one would expect that, okay, once you become John Lee Anderson, I mean, editors will just do what you tell them to. You know what I mean? It's obviously.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would like to say that it's me imposing my will, and every so often I have. You know, I think they, you know, it's a collegial process. They like to accommodate me. They know that I can do certain things, and I never am told no. But it's just this. But it's a mutual process as well, in which, you know, the editor is an important figure at the New Yorker. So we express mutual respect for one another, and in that way, the stories come about.
But you still have to negotiate in a way. So
sure, yeah.
You were saying that you were saying that every 6 weeks, for instance, you have to write, you know, one of those dispatches or blogs or something like that. But what about long reads? How much time do you actually have to prepare, I don't know, a long read on Amazon, or, you know, something really extensive, serious?
Well, I usually write about, I mean, sometimes I've written as many as 5 stories in a year, but it's unusual. It's more often about 3. Mm-hmm. So I have roughly 3 to 4 months to write each one of those stories. Now, if I was more efficient with my time, you know, if I just was like living a monastic life and only writing New Yorker stories, but had no personal life and no, friends or anything like that, I could probably write 6 pieces a year. But I don't. I write 3 or 4, and I take, roughly a minimum of about 3 weeks to report a story. It can take longer. Sometimes 2 times I might have to go to a country. So, I've been anywhere from 10 days to 4 months in the field,
But can you tell me?
And then then I come back and I write for about 3 weeks. And then we go through the editing process, which is about 3 or 4 weeks, editing and fact checking. So if assuming my editor is ready and unoccupied and can just deal with me, it could all take place in about 2 to 2.5 months. But because of the way life is, it usually takes 3 to 4 for each story. And it's pretty much full time during that time. Right. I can sometimes stop and write a comment or this or that, but
yeah. Can you tell me, how do you approach the story? For instance, do you have very clear idea of what the story is going to be like when you agree with the editor which story you will be doing? So do you know everything before you go to the field? And prepare really well, and basically everything is written once you get there. You just go and check the facts, or because of the way you are, you like to discover the world. Is it you just go there and discover the world and then you write? Is it?
Yeah, I wish, sometimes I wish I was more that first version of person you just described, the more efficient one who just goes to the field and, gets the facts and then goes back and very efficiently constructs the narrative. No, I have to have an element of the journey of discovery, or I'm really not interested. So I try to be a clean slate. It's harder the more you've been to a place. You tend to feel like you know it. You become familiar. You cease to see things as well, which I think can make for a rather arid narrative experience. You cease to see details. You no longer smell the air. You no longer look above the shop fronts and see what the buildings are like above, because you know the street. You no longer look at people's body language like you do when you arrive in a country for the first time to try to understand an unfamiliar surrounding. All of those aspects for me are really exciting in writing, and I always take lots of notes in my first days in a new place, because you're straining to understand what you're seeing. Sometimes it's an alien linguistic environment, and all of your senses come alive. And that really helps the storytelling later as well, because maybe, yes, someone more familiar with the place wouldn't make such a big deal out of, I don't know, a moment on the street, the wind going through the trees at the end of a day, or the smell of the river going through town. But I do when I'm discovering it for the first time. So I suppose, yeah. And I think these are things that are valid to do. And so I like to try to, be open and as spontaneous as possible, and to take my measure, even from people I've read about or think I know about, from how they behave with me in the setting. And also to keep an eye for parallel experiences. I've often found that going a little bit off schedule, or, not just having those talking heads of ticking the box of everybody you think you need to see, but I don't know, going off into the countryside for 2 days because someone has invited you somewhere, or you've heard about something interesting somewhere else. Very often it allows you this kind of sidelong glance back at the central stage, And it can be really informative and very often provide you with an absolutely new glimpse of the narrative you're seeking, of the reality you're exploring. I've often found that works really well for me. So yeah, and if I didn't feel, like I say, if I didn't feel excited, and if there wasn't an element of adventure to it, I don't know that I would really want to be a journalist anymore. You know, I can sit down and write blogs and daily comments, and I suppose if I couldn't get out and explore, had no curiosity in the world anymore, I could do that. I'm not sure how fulfilled I would feel, but that's just me.
I guess this is why we love your stories so much, because you do them the way you just described. But tell me something, because now you were saying, all those things you have to experience, on the street, in the mountains and everything. But then there are other more stressful things that you experience when you're working. For instance, when Bolivian military official revealed to you how Che Guevara has died and where he was buried, or when you wrote a story about Saddam Hussein's doctor. These are all stories where you have to gain people's trust. Without that, you wouldn't do anything. So it is one thing if people are at ease talking to you, but it's quite another if men of war, men who have committed terrible crimes, tell you things that they would never tell their wives. How do you do that?
I'm not sure. I found, going back to the 1980s, when I was in Central America, that maybe because of this desire of mine to understand the origins of violence and political violence, maybe I present myself in a way that doesn't seem judgmental. But I sought out violent people because I wanted to hear from them how and why they commit it. And there's always a bit of a dance, people who are really culpable of atrocities usually don't explicitly admit them, but they very often want to talk about them in a certain way or share them. Usually it's men, of course, it's a matter of pride or ego or self-exculpation. But I found myself repeatedly meeting, extremely violent people, and that they would open up to me. And I'm not really sure why, but this may sound a little off the wall or crazy, but part of me thinks it's because at one level, I think, I get violence. I get it. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of they understand that I understand. Now, I'm suspending judgment in the moment that I'm with them, perhaps, for the sake of hearing what they have to say. But of course, I have also an ethical standard, a moral standard, and I am judging them, and I certainly will later when I write. But I understand violence. And so I think they feel at ease with me. Maybe it's a guy thing, but I used to fight a lot, physically. So, I was a hothead. So I wasn't a bully, but I did end up in a lot of fights. So I kind of get violence. And if a guy is revealing violence to me, I can nod my head and say, yeah, I know what you mean. It's that kind of thing. A woman, I think, it's much, much more difficult for a woman to, anyway, this is delicate waters, and probably I shouldn't go too far there because all of a sudden people suggest that I need therapy. But no, I think, I think that's partly it. You can find out a lot from victims, of course, of violence. And God forbid, I'm not saying anything about victims here, but I was always more interested in the perpetrators of violence than in hearing what victims had to say. We know what the consequences of violence are. We all do. but it's harder to hear from the people who commit it or mete it out, how and why they do it. And that was always my sort of objective. So I think I've found a way to put people like that at ease and to get them to draw them out about their need very often it's a need or a way to mythify or legitimate something they've done. And because I understand how that works in writ large, in the life story of, say, a guerrilla leader, a Che Guevara, a FARC leader in Colombia, they have different ways, even with a Pinochet, whom I interviewed here years ago, the dictator. They all seek a way to rationalize their violence. And I've learned the codes, I think, to know how to get them to try to draw them out on those codes. And, from there, you can, once they're at ease, you can get them to, in the best of moments, you can get them to talk a little further maybe than they'd intended.
John Lee, unfortunately, I have to share you with some other people who want to ask questions. So my last question would be regarding American elections. I would like to know what you think about the media coverage of American elections. Was it fair? Was it balanced? Has it opened the right questions? Or do you think that maybe the liberal media, because of all the humiliating treatment they received under Trump government, that they maybe showed too much bias and were not balanced enough?
Oh, I mean, it's a great theme. I feel that the media, particularly the electronic media, television, appeased Trump far too much at the beginning. I think the minute he began berating journalists to their face or saying fake news, especially, and the way he mistreated people in the White House, they should have gotten up and walked out immediately. They should never have temporized with him. And I think it made it much, much worse in the end. But they were responding to kind of forms of etiquette that he simply violated. So I think that was a real problem in the beginning. And they were seeking ratings. And to a certain extent, some of the print media that was closest to power, there tends to be this kind of palace syndrome of like, don't burn your source. You want to keep the access, so you just simply grin and bear it. I think, we need all to have a real look in the mirror and to have, serious conversations about different moments of this Trump era, right through, actually, so that the media can understand, what part it played, how it was made vulnerable, how it's been weaponized, how it's now become part of the war itself, the culture wars. It's really, it's very much a watershed moment, I think. And of course, we're seeing this polarization extend throughout the world. What's so worrying is to see it finally having happened in the United States. And of course, that's only made things worse in other countries where there wasn't as much rule of law or respect for the media anyway. Yeah. It's, having said that, I know a lot of really great journalists who have been very clear from the very beginning about what Trump means and is, and Trumpism means, and they've been trying to tackle it, as best they can. The problem is that we all seem to be communicating into bubbles, into niches now. So you have, as the CNN crowd, the Fox crowd, the New York Times crowd, and then, and it's a real problem that people will only read or listen to or watch the media that tells them what they want to hear. And this is something this is, I think, our biggest issue. This is our biggest obstacle now in the free world, in the world in which we can even have this discussion, is how do we get over that? Is it because by appeasing the other? No, I don't think so. I mean, how do you understand a racist, uneducated, gun-toting Trumpite? Reading books about Appalachia and white trash, does that really help? I'm not sure it does. I think we need to really look at this one and have a really serious conversation about, maybe come to some new reckoning and some new standards that we need to adhere to as media in the West, in the places where we're able to exercise the profession.
I think everything what you've just said just now, is absolutely valid in Slovenia as well. So, there's no easy situation, I think, any longer anywhere in this world. But do we have the first question? This is the journalist, Sonja Merliaksdovs, asked me to ask you, how do you start writing after 3 weeks spending on the field? How do you think? How do you form the structure? What is the process of your writing? And then also, how does it look, that 3-week editing of the text in a case like that?
Well, I usually, before I've finished, when I'm still in the field, I write out the scenes that I think I have, because we think in scenes at the New Yorker, sort of visual scenes that are narrative blocks. And although I don't always stick with them, I usually feel okay if I feel I have between about somewhere around 10 scenes. And I usually know how I want to start. There'll be a moment, something that inspires me, but it's not something I've necessarily really crafted or thought through. Usually I'll, spend a few days kind of circling my desk when I come home, and then I'll start. And it's very often a descriptive scene. Usually it's what helps me begin writing. It's not always how it ends up in the magazine. And so sometimes, if it's about a very exotic place, the editor will feel that it really needs to have more of an informational head, like an introductory thing. So we flip-flop things. And I'm not too concerned about how the blocks are changed, although it usually means a lot more writing for me. But I will send in a draft to my editor feeling like, okay, I've done a template, this works. And then he'll call me a few days after having read it once or twice, and he'll say, I just want to ask you a few questions. And invariably, he always says dumb questions, and they're never dumb. And usually he asks questions about things I don't know or haven't dealt with. So inevitably, there begins a process in which I do a bit more writing, and then the structure may begin to change. Sometimes not too much, sometimes quite a bit. It depends on how movable or dynamic the story is, how much it's still ongoing. Usually I write a bit long, in the expectation that they'll love every word I've written. And almost invariably they want less than I've sent them. So the editor will line edit. It's like a butcher cutting out the fat. And then we usually have a back and forth about that. There's some fat that I really want, and he'll ask me to tell him why, and maybe we'll keep that fat, but I'll lose something else.
Yeah.
But in the end, that's the kind of editing process. And then eventually it will go to the fact checkers. And then that can alter it slightly again as well. And that can take a week or two, depending on what they discover. Usually it's not much, but sometimes people will want to change their attribution or not be quoted, or something will come up, or they'll discover that, a tree was blue instead of green, as I had seen. that kind of thing. And then we go to a final, it goes to the copy editors, the legal people see it. And then we finally, have this kind of the final edit, the final proofreading and conference. Usually I'm on a phone, and it can last 3 hours or it can last 10 hours. And every single comma and semicolon and em dash and word in fact expressed is gone over.
So you actually have to stay focused on this particular story until the end, until it's published. When it's published, it is okay. You can't just absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's intense. It's very intense, and it's quite unique to the New Yorker. The fact-checking idea really comes from the New Yorker, and not all journals or newspapers do it.
Sure.
And so, there's a great, and there's a New Yorker style, which is this kind of eccentric grammatical construction. That's this sort of phlegmatic tone that's used. This, the copy editor is usually women, and they usually are very they're kind of powers in their own right. Anyway, and so if you wonder why there's an umlaut in cooperation, they will tell you. So.
Okay, I think we have a question from Petra Lesiak-Tušek. Am I correct? Yeah, Petra.
Yeah. First, I would like to thank you for a very inspiring conversation. It is very refreshing because we are overwhelmed with COVID when we get up and COVID when we go to bed. So it was inspiring. Especially what I would like to add is I also believe that passion and going to the field is the basic, and being curious and talk to people and experience things. But we know, on the other hand, we have some pressures all over, that we have to be aware of the costs, and we have to stick to the sources that are closer. We don't go to the field so much anymore. But if we discuss also the attention that readers are willing to take to our articles, I think we cannot expect from them if we don't go to the field. So how do you think is going to be the perspective of all those long reads? Do you think it is necessary to still get the experience and to maintain and to stick to the classical methods of work instead of bringing the sources from Twitter and all fast and instant material, and also the methods of work? Do you think that this long read has a future perspective?
I do, not only because I, write for the New Yorker and the
Okay.
We lost him.
Mislim, da se je nekaj zgodilo v tem trenutku. Sem prepričana, da bo kolega Aljoša probal tole urediti. Imamo še nekaj minut časa, pravzaprav ne prav dosti, 6 minut. Zahvaljujem se ti, Petra, za dobro vprašanje. Torej, seveda, od vseh nas, ki smo tu na tem Zoom meetingu, samo John Lee Anderson seveda dela za New Yorker in torej dela v razmerah in pogojih, kakršnih on dela. Vsi drugi smo definitivno pravi siromački, ampak bi si pa človek to vzel kot neko tako Biblijo in jo pokazal, svojim direktorjem, svojim, lastnikom časopisov in tako naprej, in jim povedal, poglej, tako se dela, ne. Tudi jaz bi mogoče bil kdaj John Anderson, če bi imel, vsaj nekoliko teh možnosti še na voljo. Torej, zdaj v tem trenutku mislim, da je John povsem izgubil internetno povezavo, ampak tu nas je kar nekaj. Imamo še 5 minut časa, porabimo ta čas, morda še kdo ima kako idejo za kak pameten sklep iz tega, kar smo slišali. Meni se je zdelo super, kar si rekla, namerno smo se izognili covidu, seveda se lahko bi samo o covidu govorili. Ampak, zdaj pa mislim, John Lee is back again. And hi, John Lee. So glad to have you back. And you are still answering Petra's question. I think you
Yes.
have it on mute.
Yeah.
It's okay now.
Am I okay now? Sorry about that.
It's okay. It's okay.
I was going to say that, in pretty much every country I've been in Latin America, and also in Africa, actually, there's been new long read, long form format magazines, whether digital or print, launched over the past 15 or so years. And not all of them are economically, vibrant, but they provide a hugely important and desired outlet for many journalists. And there's an audience for them, just as the New Yorker has its niche audience, which has grown in the English-speaking West, from being a kind of elitist, I suppose, magazine of the Northeastern liberal intelligentsia, years ago. It's got a pretty wide audience in throughout the West. So I think it probably concurrent with this vertiginous frenzy that we all find ourselves in with Twitter or Facebook and all these other things, Instagram and television. There is this need for more reflective, deeper pieces that make sense of this increasingly chaotic world. So I do think there is a way forward. How journalism was ever a lucrative profession, and that I'm not sure we were ever, all of us, very stable in our jobs or our careers. It's always been a little bit difficult. So that's what I would say there.
Yeah, thank you. And I also think that it is very important that you emphasized as well that we all the time need learning, that you have to learn and still seek for new material and learn, because you really have to study all life.
I think so. Yeah. There's so much we don't know, and I think the more we learn about the moral world, the more we realize that we have huge, gaps in our knowledge, and I mean, we're realizing that all the time.
John Lee, unfortunately, this hour and 15 minutes has gone like this. So I feel very sad because I have about 2 pages of questions ready for you, which I will not be able to ask. But I have invitation for you. I'm sure that journalistic society will say that afterwards. But if you ever come to our part of the world, let's do that. Let's do that live. It would be so nice just to sit somewhere in Ljubljana. You have been to Ljubljana before.
I'd love to.
Okay. So let's do that.
I haven't. No, I've never been.
You haven't been. Okay, so you have some friends here, who very much read your every story when it's published. So please come and see us again. Thank you very much for this discussion.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. And thank you very much, the audience. Thank you for the questions. And we'll see you all very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.